Federation is here for good. We have been for over 100 years, and we will be for generations to come. But what does it mean to be here for good? It means that while Golda's family can't be with her these days, they can breathe a little easier knowing she's still enjoying a warm meal. And although Jennifer may be looking for work, her children can still continue their Jewish education, empowering them to become the leaders of tomorrow. Yes, we're here, not just for today, but for good. And when good gets going, it can't be stopped. Because while right now, Sarah is experiencing the wonder of Israel from thousands of miles away, she's establishing lifelong connections with its people. And on the ground in Israel, Hanan is mentoring at-risk youth, ensuring their future will be better than their parents. Thanks to the good we do here, Jews everywhere are thriving. But good doesn't just happen on its own. It grows from Federation resources and partnerships, and by working every day to ensure that our communities are safe, cared for, and flourishing, just as we have for years, just as we will for years to come. Because Federation and the good people who support us are here for good, and we're not going anywhere.
Good evening. I am Susie Brush, co-chair together with Isabella Fisk of the Holocaust Council of the Jewish Federation of Greater Metro West New Jersey. And it is my pleasure to welcome you to tonight's Author Insight program featuring Heather Dune Macadam. We are pleased to bring this program to you in partnership with Women's Philanthropy of the Jewish Federation of Greater Metro West New Jersey. My father of blessed memory miraculously survived Auschwitz with his father, brother, and cousin. His mother, Helen, and baby sister, Judith, were sadly gassed immediately upon arrival at the camp. I think about them daily as I wear this necklace, whose center stone came from a pair of earrings belonging to my beloved grandmother, who I am named for. My grandfather had the foresight to bury some family possessions in the ground at their home in Humana, Czechoslovakia, and was able to retrieve them upon returning after the war. This necklace is a source of strength for me and a constant reminder of who I am and where I come from. My mom, may she rest in peace, also from Humana, was hidden for a time with her mother, sister, and brother in the home of a righteous Gentile. Her father was a partisan and was in the mountains. Somehow, they all survived. Most of her extended family, however, and there were many of them as my grandfather was one of 11, perished in death camps, including her beloved cousin, Adela Gross, whose story is lovingly honored and included in Heather's incredible book, 999. 999 is dedicated to Edith Grossman, her sister Leah, and to Adela. Edith, who passed away in August of 2020 at the age of 96, was the wife of my father's first cousin, the author Ladislav Grossman. So to say that my meeting Heather was beshared or destined is what I believe absolutely true. And I'm forever grateful to Heather for her dedication to bringing this story to life and for honoring the memories of these incredible 999 young women in the most beautiful way. I am certain that tonight's discussion will leave a mark on your hearts. Edith is quoted as saying, "We had to be the messengers. Somebody had to survive to tell the story." Telling and retelling the stories is now our collective responsibility, and it is how we can continue to honor the legacy of those no longer with us. Thank you so much for joining us tonight. It's now my pleasure to introduce Elise Shane-Brown, Greater Metro West Director of Holocaust Education.
Thank you, Susie, for that beautiful introduction and for sharing so much of yourself and your story with us tonight. Almost 2 years ago, when you shared with me that a book that was connected to your family was going to be published, I right away knew that we had to make this a program. I have always marveled at the passion you have, Susie, to tell your story, your family's story from the Holocaust. And I'm so incredibly impressed with how you honor and share your parents' legacy. It is truly remarkable. And we thank you so much for all you do for Holocaust education, for bringing this program to us today, and for your generous donation of the first 100 books this evening. Several months ago, the Holocaust Council here at Federation made the choice to change the signature Survivor Speaks program to be titled Keeping the Stories Alive. As time continues to race against the survival of Holocaust survivors, here in GMW, we know that this cannot and will not be the end of sharing the stories of the Shoah. Because of second and third generations, as well as incredibly dedicated writers, researchers, and educators, we know that the Holocaust will never become just a memory, but rather its memory will become a driving force into how we as Jews and human beings live a life that strives towards kindness, compassion, and care. I am honored to be here this evening to introduce to you one such extraordinary person, Heather Dune Macadam, who has diligently and with so much drive and commitment eloquently told a powerful story of the Holocaust in her book, 999, The Extraordinary Young Women of the First Official Jewish Transport to Auschwitz. Heather's first book was a memoir, Rena's Promise, a story of sisters in Auschwitz, which she co-wrote with the 716th woman in Auschwitz. The telling of Rena's story is what led her to delve deeper into this transport and learn more and write about all of the women on that first transport. Heather, congratulations on the success of your book, and a tremendous thank you for bringing this remarkable story to us and for being here with us this evening.
Thank you. I've already got tears in my eyes. Susie and everybody from Women's Philanthropy and Greater New Jersey Western Federation. You guys are just amazing. Thank you so much. Before I begin tonight, I am going to light a candle for Adela and for Edith. And yeah, and I have a rock here that I always use when I'm giving these presentations as a remembrance that this is why we're here, is a memorial. And so I'm just going to, hang on one second, I just have to do my screen share, which is, you know, that important moment where we get to so I'm going to share tonight with you portions of my research, portions of a documentary I'm working on, which is based on the book. And we will get started with the beginning of the documentary so you can actually, I will give you a little heads up afterwards. It's quite amazing, the story behind how this started.
The whole tragedy starts with the girls. In my eyes, the girls were the worst. They have been the first victims.
So before we go into the book, Rena's Promise, which started me on this journey, I have to tell you that those home movies that you just saw are a cousin of Susie's, who I was at the Holocaust Museum on my book tour in DC, and I found these amazing home movies. And as I was watching them, I recognized Edith's husband when he was a little boy, Ladislav Grossman, because I had seen a picture of him wearing his little cap and he's like going like that. And I texted Edith's son and I was like, George, isn't this your dad? And he goes, oh my God, that's my grandfather next to him. And we didn't know about these home movies. And I think it's Robert Klein or Ronald Klein gave us permission to use them in the film. And once again, it's like this amazing circle of synchronicity and beshert. And I have to say, you know, I often feel like I'm sailing a ship and the rudder, I can't see where it's going, but I'm always amazed. And one of the most amazing things was that I was in Slovakia. I went to Slovakia in honor of Rena. And I was living in Europe at the time. And I decided that I would go on the 70th anniversary of the first transport. And I went to Poprad, Slovakia, thinking, you know, nothing was going on in Slovakia. And there was a huge event. And Susie's cousins were there, Slovakian cousins. And I left a piece of paper with a rock with names of women that I knew, young women who were on the first transport, Rena, Danka, who were in my first book, and Adela Gross, because Rena knew Adela in Humane, Slovakia. And the next thing I know, the Gross family is contacting me. And 70 years, they didn't know what had happened to Adela. And this is Lou, Adela's cousin. He was 4 years old when he watched his beautiful cousin, who had amazing red hair, go willingly to work for a shoe factory, because that's what they told they were going to do, and disappeared off the face of the earth. And because of witness testimony, Rena telling me about watching Adela go to the gas chamber, and I wrote about it, the Gross family suddenly came into my life. Then I met Edith Grossman, who was 92 at the time, and her sister was best friends with Adela's sister, Dutsi, who was still alive at that time. She did survive the Holocaust. She didn't go to Auschwitz. And you know, there it once again sort of became, you know, this unfolding and this connection. And Edith was able to tell me things about the first transport that nobody else had told me. And part of that was because of an amazing memory, but also because she was a local girl in Humane, and Rena was an implant. She was a refugee from Poland, so she had a different relationship with the Slovak community. And Edith knew, you know, all the girls on the transport that she was with, she grew up with. And so they had this, you know, what I immediately learned about this transport from Edith was that they weren't strangers. They were cousins and sisters and distant cousins and classmates. They all knew each other, especially in their towns. And that was really new information for me. And once again, what I kept being pushed towards was, if I could bring peace to Adela's family, or give them answers to what happened to Adela 70 years after the fact, how many other girls were out there? How many other families were out there still haunted by the loss of their girls?
It was glued on the houses, an announcement that all the Jewish girls, non-married girls from 16 up, have to come to the school on this and this street the 20th of March 1942. My parents had two girls ripe to go. My mother was so against, and my father, he was so disciplined, you know. He said, it's a law, we have to do it. And my mother said, it's a bad law. And my father said, but it's a law. And we have to send those kids.
My mother said, hey, you don't have to go, or something like, you know. And that was the first time maybe that I disobeyed my mother. So I said, no, I want to go.
I'm going to
my
pause here,
friends.
right here, because this is the woman who's speaking right here is Margita Becker, but they called her Monsi Becker. This is Edith when she was a little girl, and they knew each other. And we just missed her. Edith's sister is over here.
Friends are very important at that point, so I didn't want to be left behind.
So we went to the school, and it was a formal checkup, really a formal checkup. And there was something that we were very surprised, and SS was sitting there. The doctor and an SS by the table when they were checking us.
So that's an excerpt of the movie The Bride, which was a book that Edith's husband wrote. And it was called The Bride. Originally, he was going to call it 1000 Virgins. And it is about the first transport. And one of the things that they did was, we all know that the Judenrat collected names of Jews in their towns. This is from Humane, and it is the list. It's in alphabetical order, and so we're in the Friedman Overs, and there's Leah and Edita, and this is where they lived. And so this is the street address. So if you didn't show up at the school voluntarily, the police knew where to go. So you can see that this was checked, that Leah and Edith showed up, but Margita Friedmanova didn't. And that was actually Edith's sister, who had a disability. And she was allowed not to go to Auschwitz because her parents had an exemption, which means that her father did special work for the government. So they collected those lists, right? Were in Barjov and Stropkov and Preshov and all of these little towns, and they collected all of these girls and they brought them to a former army barracks in Poprad. This is the Polish border here. Rena was from Tillage. There's also a girl from Kranica. Her name was Sarah. And there we have somebody from Novosaj, who you'll hear about later. Her name is Ida. And so they collected them all, and they ended up with 999 sorry, what happened? There we go. So one of the things that I find really shocking about this is that, you know, this is slave labor, except slaves are purchased and owned. As awful as that sounds, these girls were sold, not sold. The Slovak government paid the Nazis to take them, and they paid them 200 Reichmark per girl to take them away. That's the equivalent today of 3,000 USD. So I've got a typo there, I apologize. I find that just shocking. And this is actual, you could call it the bill of lading. This is the original invoice, railway invoice for deportation to Auschwitz. You can see here, this is, there's supposed to be 1,000 girls. There were 999. This is the cost per girl to deport them to Auschwitz. This is the amount, this is how much the railway charged for their luggage. 360, I guess it's Reichmark, 3,700 for the girls. And you can see the date here, that's March 25th, 1942, that they were deported. It was not legal in Slovakia to deport Jews. Jews were still citizens. So one of the lovely euphemisms of the Slovak government, they called them volunteer workers, because they volunteered, they showed up willingly to go. They were told they had to, but that was what they called them in order to get around that legal snafu. Now, this is Orna Tuckman, and she is in Yad Vashem. So one of the things that was really important for me was to find the list, find the names of everybody on this list. This is Orna's mother, Marta Friedmanova, and this is the list right here. Talking. This, you can see the list right here. This has got Leia's name, Edith's name, and Adela Gross's name. And on the same list, I made this box too big, so you can't really see it. But on the same page of this list is, I have to look, where is it? Kornreich, there's Atella and Rivka Kornreich. Atella, her name was Drenger. She was Rena's best friend from Tillage, Poland, and that's Rena. So they were all next to each other, getting their names typed up on this list.
We had to line up 5 in rows and march to the railroad station. And far away we saw already a long track of cattle cars. We didn't even think of it, that those are suited for us. We are human beings. The guards started screaming in Slovakia, natural, up, dirty Jewish horse, and so on.
They put us in trains. We didn't know where we are going. We didn't have any idea. We were about 50 or maybe 60. Not water, not anything, not a little window, and locked from outside.
Train that went to Helena and then heads up to Auschwitz.
The train stopped in the middle of a field.
There was an empty place at the side, nothing.
When we came closer, we saw the barbed wire and we saw the barracks. We came and marched through an iron gate. The gate opened, on top Arbeit macht frei. On the left side was a huge brick building with a huge chimney. So we whispered to each other, that's the factory where we are going to work.
We just wondered. we just wondered what's going to happen to us.
We were the first 1,000 women who ever entered the gates of hell there.
One of the things that's really important for us to acknowledge is that that list that Yad Vashem has gives us the birth years of the young women on this transport, but there are a lot of typos. And in my research, I was a bit confused, like, why were there so many women in their 30s and 40s? Well, it turns out that a lot of those women that I thought were in their 30s and 40s were teenagers. Just, it only takes one digit. Were you born in 1924 or were you born in 1914? And that's 10 years. And so we actually do not know accurately how many teenagers were on the transport. Originally, when I did my research and analyzed it all, I said there was 268. Now, because I have found survivors who, or daughters or children of survivors who've said, no, my mother was, she died when she was 90. She couldn't have been born in 1914, right? I know that there are so many typos in there. So I would guess that this transport is probably over half teenage girls. And as one of my survivors' daughters says, it's really hard to believe that 16-year-old girls were considered enemies of the state. So this is the original layout of the camp. This map comes from the Auschwitz Memorial Museum. And if you've been to Auschwitz in Poland, where the big gate is, this is the entrance where you come in. But back then in 1942, this beat was the main entrance. And there was a wall here. This was the men's camp up here, and this was the women's camp. And they came in here, and this is block 10, where the first transport was kept. And right next to it is block 11, or block Smierci, and that's where they were executing spies and Russian POWs. So we are going to talk about block 10 now.
So we wore their clothes. They were dirty and
I'm going to pause you right 1 second. Sorry. So the other thing about the girls in 1942 was they were put into dead Russian prisoners' uniforms. And this is a drawing that is drawn by a Polish artist. These are actual portraits of women. You will see, this is Rena, this is Edith, this is Berta Berkowitz, Pesci Steiner, and coming up is Adela. And this artist took the portraits and then, using our description of the clothing, has created scenes so we can see what we've never seen before. And Edie's explaining it to us.
And we had to wear those pants and the jacket from those soldiers. When it was so pouring rain and working all day, that suit was soaking wet. And when we came back to the camp, and everybody wanted to take off the wet clothes, so it's funny, we were putting, and there was no heat. So there was, like in middle of the barrack, there was something of bricks made, a long thing, I don't know, it's a chimney used to make, a bee or whatever. And everybody was putting there, and one put in another, and piled up that high. And you never got in a dry suit. And the next morning you put on a wet one again. So a lot of people got sick and got cold and got pneumonia. But my God, somebody got sick in camp, and we had a little medical thing, they call it revere. And if you go in there, you ask for help, they give you help, you never get out of there.
So block 10 is not open to the public. I've been there several times, and because of the survivors I've known on the first visit back in 2012, I felt like I'd been there before. The block of his room was where Elsa slept. That was the blockova for block 10. And these are the stairs that they went up. Rena slept upstairs. Edith did as well. And probably Adela, because Edith always said that everybody stayed close together, especially in Auschwitz. I was just pointing to the block of his room. Nothing is in here today, but the rooms back then were full of 3-tier bunk beds, and they had straw mattresses, which was a luxury considering where they're going to end up in a couple of months. This is another artistic drawing of what the girls looked like at roll call. Roll call was at 4 o'clock in the morning. It was several hours. This is in front of block 10. And it didn't matter if it was cold or not, you were outside doing your roll call. The other thing that the girls had to do was demolition. So this is this bizarre. And it's filmed in a movie that was shot in 1946 in Poland by Polish prisoners. It's a narrative film, it's fiction, but they actually shot it in Auschwitz before it was a museum with actual prisoners. So what they're showing us here is how they used to push walls down. And the survivors tell us that if you were on the other side of the wall, when they pushed it down, the girls on the other side got crushed. We have no idea how many young women died in early 1942. They kept no records of death records on young women until August, September 1942. This is another work detail that they did, tossing bricks, and you would put them in one pile, and the next day you'd have to toss them back, and your hands would bleed and get blistered. It was work to kill you. It was, it was not the sort of work that young teenage girls should be doing. By July 1942, camp had grown. So we went from 1,000 to 8,000, and then in a couple of weeks, there were 14,000. So this, we are trying to show here exactly how the population grew. There were also Nissan huts here for sleeping. And one of our survivors describes that it was so full that you had to step over people. They were sleeping outside. So they had to move them to Birkenau. And this is Birkenau. Now, Birkenau in 1942 had no death gate. It was only over here. That was all that existed. And wood, I'm going to show this again. It is absolutely enormous. So this didn't exist yet. The women's camp was over here. The men's camp would become over here, but at that point, it was only a women's camp. So we are talking about, this is the women's camp right here, and this was getting built up. This is block 25, which was sort of the sick block. If you went in there, you never got out. It's what Edie was talking about. And block 13 was where Edith and her sister were. And I'm going to just go back, sorry. Because when Edith's sister, it's one of the saddest parts of the story is that Edith's sister dies. And she ends up in block 25, and Edith is able to sneak along there in the dark. And I believe Margita Becker, probably because they were good friends, gave her an armband to get in to see her sister. You could only get in and out of block 25 if you had an armband, and Margita Becker had one because she worked for the Lycan Commando collecting dead bodies. Lovely job. That was considered a good job. And Margita actually says she pinched her cheeks in order to get it. This is what the blocks look like inside in Birkenau. Much different than what we had in Auschwitz. So you can see that where in Auschwitz, we can't see them, but they were wood bunks. These are stone. You slept on the floor with the rats. You had one more tier up here, and there was a third tier up higher. Excuse me, very few windows. And suffocating, just very, in the summer it was incredibly hot, in the winter it was incredibly cold. I fast forward now because we can't cover 3 years in 30 minutes, and we can't cover 3 years in a lifetime, I think. But so I mentioned good jobs. So the Lycan Commando was considered a good job collecting bodies. One of the other good jobs was working in Canada, and that was sorting through clothes and goods of the Jews who were coming in and going to the gas. So Linda Reich, who we heard earlier, this is Linda right here, and this is her friend Mira Gold. And they are sorting pots and pans. This is a photograph that was taken by an SS man. They were forced to smile. One of the things we have to keep very aware of in terms of our film is that any images in Auschwitz are staged, right? Anything with a prisoner is staged, unless it is of the SS watching Jews go to the gas. That's not staged. It's all SS taking photographs, right? There's nobody else able to take a photograph. And so, the fact that they are looking happy is merely that they're afraid for their lives. And over here on the outside are lines of Hungarian Jews going to the gas, thousands of people. And it was one of the things about Canada that was so devastating for the women who worked there, because they are sort of like decoys, right? They're dressed, they get extra food, so they're not starving to death. They're allowed to grow their hair. When they first arrive in Auschwitz, they had their heads shaved, so it doesn't look that bad, right? So people seeing them thought, oh, and also many of the Slovaks saw each other. They saw their neighbors. These are other girls that died in Auschwitz. Part of my work has been hearing from families, and send me memorial photographs. For me, this is the most important part of my work, to be able to honor young women like Adela Gross, Magduska Hartman, Maya Hahn, Magda Amster, Olinka Hartman. They were cousins. This is Anu Moshkovitz. She was a good friend of Edith's. She liked to go on bread day to Edith's mother. She loved Edith's mother bread. This young woman did survive, and she was actually a good friend of Edith's and her husband, Vladislav. She worked in the partisans. This is Leah, Edith's sister, and this is Anna Herskovikova, and she died as well. And this is Rosa Zimmerspitz. She and all 4 of her sisters were executed for trying to escape. Once again, wiped off history. Nobody knows about it except the surviving cousins who can talk about it. Of course, the only way out of Auschwitz was either to be deported or to go on the death march. Most of the women that I spoke to or know were on the death march, and it is so we can see there's at the death march, it's like, you come from this and you fan out, and they ended up all over the place. So most of them did this track down to Wojciechowski, but there are a few that went this direction, and that was 2-week march in a blizzard, and really, really grueling. Then we go over to this map. So when they get to Wojciech, they get on trains, and these are, sorry, don't know why it's doing that. So these are, they're coal cars. They're put in open, not covered, open coal cars, and it's so cold that many, many girls die, and they've had no food for days. They eat the snow, and many of them end up in Ravensbrück up here, which is the women's camp, the German women's camp for German women prisoners. It's so crowded that they have to sleep outside. And Edith describes how they sat in a V, like, like one into each other in a V, leaning against each other. Really, really devastating. And at the time that they're in Ravensbrück, starving to death, is when Auschwitz is liberated. So Auschwitz is liberated on January 27th, 1945, but for the women who survived the death march and Ravensbrück, they will not be liberated until May 1945. Some of them will be liberated in April 1945. This is an amazing photo of women leaving. Some prisoners decided to risk it and stay. A lot of them didn't, because the rumor was they were going to burn everybody inside of the camp. So many, many people went, men and women went on the death march that might have survived better if they had stayed, but nobody knew. As Rena said, they got you coming and going. There was no easy way. On the liberation of Europe, we had women all over Europe. Bertha Berkowitz, this is Bertha in Bergen-Belsen. This is Bertha here as well. This is Marta Mengel and her cousins up here, Fanny and Etta. They get to Prague, and they are escorted by Polish and Czech men and walked back to Slovakia so they don't get raped, because of course everybody's gone a bit crazy with liberation, so women were not all safe. This is Edie, who you heard talking about the uniforms and how wet they were and how they had to wear them as wet uniforms. That's Edie. She's in Pocking, Germany. We found this on JDC. When her daughter found the photograph, her mother loved to knit, and she's wearing the same outfit that she wore for her passport photo, which was how we recognized her. And this is a displaced persons camp. And this is Rena and her sister Danka. They were liberated from Neustadt Gleva, which was a satellite camp from Ravensbrück, and they went to Holland. So from, not everybody went back to Slovakia, right? A lot of women decided, that's it. I have family in America. I'm going there. And many never came back to Slovakia. And which is one of the reasons why it's very hard to know how many women survived. So my rough estimate, my guesstimate is probably about 200. But we will never know for sure, because if they didn't share their testimony and they didn't have their numbers recorded, and one of our, then we don't have a way of tracking that history. And many of these women took their stories to the grave. They didn't want to talk about it. They wanted to protect their children, and so we don't know everything. I have one last thing I want to say here, and it is about Tikkun Olam, and I'm afraid I'm going to cry. So I sat on the board for Cities of Peace Auschwitz. This is the painting that was created in Krakow for the 75th anniversary of the liberation of Auschwitz. And it is the night sky of Auschwitz, the night of liberation. And each of these stars was painted by a different person. You can see a local rabbi taking on one of the stars. People from all over the world came and painted the stars. And this is the full painting. And one of the reasons I do this work is because I believe we can repair the world by bringing these stories to the world and speaking the truth and acknowledging our history and finding the lost girls of the Holocaust. And I just have to say that the woman who created this painting is in hospice tonight, and so I'm lighting candles for her too. There's my metaphor for how we have to recreate the world, and I ask you all to help us remember the girls. Thank you very much for letting me share. Thank you, Susie, for bringing me on to this wonderful event. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Heather, for sharing all of that with us. It was truly special and remarkable, and we are so grateful to have had you here with us today. To continue the program, I'm going to ask you a few questions, and then if anybody else has questions, please feel free to put them in the chat, as I know we're all so incredibly moved and touched by everything that you shared with us today. Having been to Auschwitz, I still, even having been there, when I see things like your work and what you've done, I marvel at how incredible and impactful it is. And so going with that, my first question, because so much has been written and spoken about and done over the years, specifically on Auschwitz, why this story? Why now? How did you come to it? It's just truly remarkable. And if you can share a little bit with us on how that came about, we would love to hear it.
I have to say, I was dragged kicking and screaming to this book. I really didn't want to write about the Holocaust again. And Rena's promise, I really did it for the family. You know, I heard Rena's story, and in the midst of it, I went, oh my God, Rena, this is an amazing story. This is a book. And, but it started out just, you know, I mean, her husband, they used to pay me like $25 a month for gas. a long time ago. And and it was on that memorial journey that I took in 2012 when I discovered Susie's family and the Gross family, and Dutsi had just passed away, Adela's sister, and she didn't know what had happened to her sister. And Anna Shved, who is her daughter, is now a dear friend of mine, and Lou, who and I think Joan Gross is on tonight, Lou's widow. And I also have to give a shout out to Rosette Rutman in Toronto, and Orna. I see that you came on from Melbourne. Orna was the one at Yad Vashem looking at the list. And you know, when you start to connect with the families, the story is more important than your ego or your resistance. And it really, it just sort of took over. It, you know, it's the wind in the sails of the story is the love of these families who lost their loved ones in the Holocaust. And all I'm doing is, you know, sort of steering the ship, I guess. I don't know. Yeah. So it just sort of, it was a snowball. It just got bigger and bigger, and you can't say no when it's really rolling.
Right. And it's truly remarkable. And everybody that reads it, that I've recommended to, or that I've read about, comes back and says how touched they are by the individual stories. And we know in Holocaust education and in Holocaust memory in the years to come, that it's so important that these stories be shared, because that's the essence of how it's going to continue on.
Well, and I just will add here, because, you know, as a writer, I'm not always aware why I'm doing something. But when I hear from readers, that is really that I wanted to create a multiple narrative. I wanted to show Lou Gross going through the Holocaust. I wanted to show Ivan Jarny. I wanted to have these people, these witnesses, as well as the women who don't survive and survive, tell these threads of the story, because it is a tapestry, right? All of these stories, and when we make these people real, right? When you actually care, it changes your perspective.
Absolutely. And are there stories that, obviously the book is only a certain amount and there were 999, were there other stories that you came across, or how you came across them, that you continue to want to share that haven't had the opportunity to be able to do so?
Well, yeah, I mean, I could do volume 2 at this point, because since the book's come out, there's so many other stories. And you know, and I've had people want me to do the second transport, and I've actually, the book I just finished is on the first convoy from France of young women, which is the third convoy from France. But I'm really interested in young women's stories, because they are untold. And one of the reasons young women's stories are untold is they were uneducated. They were not important socially, or, you know, that these are, you know, why are teenage girls important? Well, we know why they're important, right? And I think it's important for us to inform the world, because, you know, this is our history.
I have a few questions coming in the chat, so I'm going to stop with my questions for a second and answer. I also see some hand raised. We're not going to take live questions tonight, so if you want to ask something, please put it in the chat. This question, I have certainly some interesting answers, but I'm curious to hear yours. Someone put in the chat, I'm now reading The Tattooist of Auschwitz, and knowing that you wrote about Auschwitz, you've read it, how accurate do you think it is?
It's not accurate.
Okay, we agree.
First of all, that there was yeah, I mean, I haven't read it, but I have a big beef against fiction, Holocaust fiction, because it's really easy to romanticize. And the next book that she wrote, Edith knew the, you know, Seeley, who she wrote about, and Seeley, there's a reason Seeley ended up in a gulag, and it wasn't because she was a nice person. And the Tattooist of Auschwitz, one of the biggest things I know about is that they have a woman getting tattooed at 40,000. Men were being tattooed at 40,000 in 1942. Women, 1,000, 2,000, right? 40,000 happens for women in 1943. 70,000 in 1944. Many, many, many more women died in Auschwitz than men, and were tattooed in Auschwitz. More men were tattooed in Auschwitz than women, because women went with their children to the gas chamber.
Right, because women, of course. And men at first, especially, were used as more slave labor, so there were more men that stayed alive. So thank you for sharing that, and we certainly do agree on that. Somebody is saying that her mom was a survivor of Auschwitz and the Death March, and she was also from a small town in Slovakia, but they were not deported until Passover 1944. So do you have any evidence or can explain why some Slovak towns were transported much earlier and others quite later?
Well, part of it was just logistics. So President Tiso, they made it legal to deport Jews in Slovakia in May 16th, 1942. And at that point, thousands, right? I mean, immediately the numbers in Auschwitz jump, right? Not just Slovaks, but Poles are coming in, the French are coming in, and the Dutch start arriving in July. So, but in August 1942, the Slovak people start to go, wait a minute, what's going on? What's happening with, and so Tiso has to stop the deportations and slow them down. He goes back to it in 1944, but there is a year and a half there where the Slovaks are not being deported. And I think it's probably September when they actually stop. And one of our survivors, Bertha Berkowitz, she's on the first transport. Her sister is on the last transport. And that's in the fall of 1944. And so so it sort of depends where you were, and it sort of depends on the luck of the draw. Yeah. That's the short answer.
Right. I understand. The next question is, are there any records of the women that were actually on the Death March?
There are not, no. And I'm just going to write to somebody who's, her hand is up, and I'm just going to. Sorry. So no, there are no records for the Death March. At that point, we know how many women were on the Death March. And I could probably look it up for you, but it would take me a minute. This is my Bible. You can see how much this is.
That's got some markups.
Well-used book, and it is the day-to-day records of Auschwitz, and it tells me, who was on, how many people were on the first, how many people were on transports, how many went to the gas. Not everything is always accurate, and as I say regularly, we have to remember who was benefiting from these numbers. So one of my big points in the book is that on December 5th, 1942, which is Shabbat Hanukkah, there was all the survivors and all the witnesses. So the survivors are women, the witnesses are men, right? Say 10,000 girls went to the gas that night. And that they, from 1,000 women in the block, there might be 10, right? The SS records say no mention of the big selection, and they say that 2,000 were selected a couple days earlier. No records. Right. So we have to remember that these numbers, there's a reason they didn't keep the numbers of women who died in early 1942, and the reason we don't know what happened to Adela is they didn't keep the numbers. And when they selected women for the gas, they didn't always, they might have written down their names, but that doesn't mean that number survived, because they burnt the records at the end. They burnt everything, especially the women's records.
So you were able to find a lot, but we also know that those records are missing lots of pieces and holes in it. Back even before this and when you wrote the first memoir, how did you first get interested in Holocaust testimony and remembrance and research to start?
You know, I wanted to be a writer, and I had written another book for somebody who had survived something really horrible, and it ended up not getting published, but we had a lot of interest, and so I had finished working on that, and a friend of mine who knew Rena ended up telling her a bit about her story, and she said, "Oh, you should write a book." And Rena said, "I need somebody with kind eyes
Mm-hmm.
to
You
listen."
do.
And she said that was me. And actually, the first night she called me, I tell the story in the book. It's so cute because she called me and I was making pierogies, and she immediately thought I was Polish, and I was like, "No, I just like pierogies." And she said it was a sign from God.
That's very true. Well, we're glad that you got into doing this and telling this story. Can you share any interesting moments in the camp that different testimony, like was there overlap? Was testimony collaborated with the survivors and their families that you can share with us?
Um, there's a lot. Yeah. I mean, so many times, it is that tapestry, right? So if I hear, one of the reasons Edith was so important in terms of this history was that she helped validate things that other people had said. And then I could go to her. She was absolutely sharp as a tack to the day she died. And I could go to her and say, "Edith, what about this?" And she'd go, she absolutely. So she gave me a lot of validation on the stories. Rena was the same way, but she died much, she didn't live as long as Edith. And so, it almost like they were soaking it up so that they could share it later, remembering everything.
Thank you for sharing that. I know you traveled to Slovakia to do a great deal of research. Can you speak to us a little bit about what it was like to do that and what it is like in Slovakia now? Do you see anti-Semitism? Is there acceptance of the history there? Can you shed some light on that, please?
There's not a lot of Jews in Slovakia. There are, I do know that there are small communities. Prešov still the great synagogue is still there in Prešov. It's quite beautiful. I'm not hanging out in Slovakia, so I don't speak Slovak, so it sort of limits how much I understand what's going on. I spend a lot of times with papers and dictionaries and reading through things and archives that are very dusty. So I can't really address that, and I haven't been there in a couple of years at this point because of COVID. But we are going to have a screening of the documentary for the 80th anniversary in Poprad for the anniversary commemoration, God willing, that COVID doesn't make that a virtual event.
Right.
And we are, so I will be there for that. And I used to try and go for those events quite often. But the other thing is, one of my sources who gave me some archival material that his family had, he moved from Israel to Slovakia. And I was like, really? Like, why'd you do that? And he said, well, there's less bombing and there's better beer. So I think that young people are coming back to Slovakia, and that will certainly help change things. Or
We'll change it. Well, you'll have to keep us posted on that. Going on just a few questions before we start to wrap up. Is there any regular group of the survivors? Was there a regular group of the survivors from this transport, or the generations of survivors of the transport? Have they ever gotten together or had any kind of meeting or anything like that?
Yeah, absolutely. And I have some wonderful photographs. that I probably can't show you right off, but there are some in the book actually. They, especially the women of Canada, because they worked together and were they bonded very closely.
You want to just explain for a moment? I'm not sure how many people know what Canada was and why
Canada
it was
was
even
the
called
sorting,
Canada.
the Canada was the sorting detail where they sorted the clothes. And there's some wonderful photographs of women. Actually, I can probably show. From the first transport and the second and third transport, here we go. So this is, can you see that? There they are. That's 3 of the women from Canada. And then, oh, and here, and this is, these are all survivors of the first and second transport in Australia. And they used to get together. And one of Orna's on tonight. One of the, Orna said that she would hear them laughing, right? And they would be telling stories about how they outsmarted the SS and things they did to survive. And it's that the same thing I heard of the other group of women. So they were very, very close, those survivors. Rena never knew anybody from the first transport, but she knew Dina and her friend Erna, but she was very bonded to her sister, and everybody sort of went off in separate directions. And so it was harder for them. They didn't end up in America. So one woman, Dina, was in France, and Erna and Fela, they were sisters and best friends. They went to Sweden, and then they went to Israel. So it became hard to sort of keep in touch.
When is the movie?
Hold on one second. I'm just going to answer Amy Reese. Rena died, let's see, she died in 2007. So she was 87. And she also had Alzheimer's at the time. So yeah. Thanks.
And when is the movie expected to be released?
Madly working on it. I just got music from we have a Slovak composer, which is one of the reasons I wanted to play that beginning, because that is Slovakian music. And we have a wonderful composer who I met at one of the ceremonies in Slovakia. So we just got some music for the film that she's writing, and I'm hoping with it, it will definitely be next year. Hopefully by March, when we have a screening, we're going to start to submit it to festivals.
Yes, and certainly please keep us posted on that.
I will. Yeah.
And before we conclude, for our last question, over 75 years after the liberation of Auschwitz, and with some of these these women having, some of them survived all of that time in Auschwitz, is there anything of the legacy that you hope to be able to spread as you share this story?
For me, this is really about young women and young women's plight in the world today, as well as history. So, if you want to destroy a race of people, young women are the ones who are attacked, and we've seen it, thousands of years. I just finished reading a book about the Trojan women, and women being scooped up into slavery and becoming sexual slaves is one thing. Auschwitz didn't have that. It had slave labor and being worked to death and being sterilized, and so as a way of destroying the race. So for me, this is a human rights and women's rights and girls' rights issue, and it's why it is so important, because we need to be aware that in many, many places in the world, and unfortunately in this country, young women are still treated like second-class and third-class citizens and don't have the rights of human beings. And that's why this work is so, there's a reason why this story is happening now, and it didn't happen 50 years, 40 years ago. Nobody cared, right? This is the Me Too movement. When the Me Too movement happened, I was like, oh, this is really interesting because my book is coming out. And suddenly it was like, yeah, like this is important material. It's time that we get recognized that young women are on the front lines, and they deserve to be recognized and protected. And I'm seeing so many things in the chat, and I'm sorry.
Yeah.
Listen, everybody. First of all, we have a newsletter at 999themovie.com. You can get information about the documentary by signing up to that newsletter. I only write once a month. You're lucky if I do, to give you the latest updates. And if you have any questions that we haven't covered tonight, we have 999 on Facebook. You can ask me questions there, and you can also email me through 999themovie.com. And these are great questions. And I will just say about the gun factory, of course, the ammunition factory is where the women were working who smuggled gunpowder out to blow up the crematoriums. And I know that the women who were caught and executed were only part of that. The women in Canada who were helping smuggle that gunpowder to the Sonderkommando to blow up the crematoriums, one of them was caught, that was Rosa Rabata, but Erna Drenger was also part of it. And none of the 4 women who were arrested and caught for blowing up the crematoriums ever spoke a single name of the other women or men in the underground and in the resistance who helped blow up those the crematoriums. And well, one crematorium. But what I'm very aware about the story is there's a lot to that story that we don't know, because those women never spoke, and the ones who were helping didn't speak either. You know, it's sort of like being in the CIA. It's like, we keep it all secret.
Right, keep it together. Well,
Yeah.
thank you so much. We are incredibly moved from you sharing today, and everyone on here is so honored to hear from you. And we look forward to the film and your next book, and so much. We'll have to have you back after that, and so much more to come. The Holocaust Council was thrilled to partner with Women's Philanthropy on this, and we hope this is the beginning of even more endeavors. To close our program, I'm happy to introduce Heidi Cohen.
Good evening. I am Heidi Cohen, Vice President in Women's Philanthropy of Jewish Federation of Greater Metro West. I hope you enjoyed the program, and thank you again, Heather Dune Macadam, for sharing such a fascinating and important story. It gives me great pride to share just some of the important ways that Federation cares for over 400 vulnerable Holocaust survivors living in our community. Through our annual campaign and generous supporters like you, in partnership with our 2 Jewish family service agencies, we help meet survivors' medical and emotional needs, providing at-home care, kosher meals on wheels, assistance with getting the services they are entitled to, and many important social programs. Through our Holocaust Council, we keep their stories alive, giving them a platform to share their experiences and lessons learned with adults and students throughout New Jersey and beyond. The needs in our community are so critical today, and we hope that you will support our efforts with our 2022 annual campaign. Now you will see our website address in the chat box. Thank you for joining us tonight, and please visit our Jewish Federation website to donate, to find out more about upcoming events, volunteer opportunities, and all of the important work that we do. Good evening.